Hello, everyone. We welcome you once again to another Cosmic Matrix podcast with your hosts, Bernhard Günther and my wife, Laura Matsu. And this is a very important topic we want to cover in this podcast. And I already have written a Substack article on it. You can check it out. It was titled, Why People Abandon Inner Work and the Path to the Temple of Secrets, What It Really Takes to Stay the Course of Inner Evolution. I will release this article on my main website, veilofreality.com as well. However, in this podcast, we are going to dive even deeper into this topic, weaving in all kinds of stories, tying it into spiritual warfare, astrology, esoteric principles, and personal experiences, and really address this topic really in depth. So the title for this podcast is Spiritual Shocks, Why Souls Tend to Evolve Under Pressure. And the basis for this is really understanding, which we've all seen in our lives, right? When you try to make changes in your life, be it maybe something more, conventional, I would say, like you want to work out, start losing weight or eating healthier. But in the context of our work here and what we are doing, and especially what Laura and I teach in doing our programs or what you do in your inner life, it's maybe a deeper call, right? The call to engage in deeper shadow work, inner child healing, somatic trauma release work, be it relationship work, or starting a sincere spiritual practice like meditation, pranayama, breath work, even sincere prayer, or conscious body-mind practices like Qigong, Tai Chi, or the yoga asanas, and so forth, right? At first, you're inspired. We all are inspired to dive into it, right? You watch the videos, you want to learn more about it. You want to study, you read the books, and maybe even sign up for a course, or you go to a retreat or workshop just to immerse yourself deeper and learn the practices, right? But at some point, it could be days into it, weeks or months into it, the spark all of a sudden fades, right? You stop practicing, you don't finish the course or even the book. Old patterns creep back in, you get distracted. That's very common, especially nowadays, as we know. Or the very typical excuses I've seen in many people, and myself included. Oh, I don't have the time. Not now, it's not the right time. Or this is just not working right now for me. You may blame the content of the practice or the topic itself. You may blame the teacher or the people around you. And you may even start projecting on others and get upset how others are not doing the self-work. I see this a lot. I've seen this within myself as well, right? Be it your partner, your family, your friends, or the world at large. But really, it's your own projection and mirrored back to you of how you really feel about yourself because you're not sincerely engaged in the work. Most often what we preach, we need to apply to ourselves first and foremost, right? Maybe sometimes you offer advice no one asked for. And when it's really, again, what you need to apply to yourself first and foremost. Maybe you tell yourself that you don't need to do this work anymore, that you're already advanced and, know it all. But in truth, the ego maybe has hijacked the process here. We'll talk about that as well. You may start to identify as a spiritualized or spiritual persona or person and then mistake that identification of genuine awakening. You may use philosophical and spiritual ideas to bypass the more challenging somatic, psychological, emotional work, also typical, known as spiritual bypassing. But most often what feels like spiritual evolution or quote-unquote higher states of consciousness is maybe often subtle pride and disguising itself into some sort of evolved, advanced persona that avoids the deeper work, while you believe yourself to be more evolved than others. Or you think you are doing the work, but really you're just intellectualizing it. I can definitely relate to that, especially in the past, because you confuse mental awareness with transformation or healing or insight or integration. Or you mistake the collection of knowledge and information for genuine understanding and embodied wisdom. You may talk about your triggers and issues and know the stories all intellectually, but you never truly integrate or embody the healing. And so you keep lying to yourself, wasting time and energy, imagining you're on the path towards awakening, while your false persona and the ego has hijacked the process a long time ago already. I can relate to all of this, right? I've lied to myself plenty of times. I've had my own excuses and rationalizations. Some of it I've already shared on various podcasts and my writings. But I see the same pattern more and more in countless others over the years. Lauren, both, and I have seen that, definitely. So the question really is, why do so many seekers, why do so many of us start with this enthusiasm, sincerity, and then abandon the work or do it half-heartedly? Why do books, practices, or courses that once felt life-changing end up half-finished or forgotten? Obviously, we live in a time where access to spiritual teachings is everywhere. We have tremendous access to all kinds of knowledge, practices, all of that. But most people, most of us, don't follow through. We get too busy. We sabotage the process the moment it gets uncomfortable. And it's really important to understand, obviously, by the nature of the work, we may know it intellectually, but the truth is, real inner work isn't comfortable. It demands everything the wounded ego is built to avoid: facing the shadow, feeling the emotions we've repressed or repressed, breaking free from childhood wounding and conditioning, and stepping really into radical truth. Now, here's the deeper reason people fall off, and we go deep into that in this podcast. We often lack the spiritual will, the inner fire, the sincerity, and the humility to walk the path all the way through, especially when resistance appears. And that's really what this podcast is about. So, in part 1 of this podcast, we explore why most people abandon inner work and how the awakening process so often gets hijacked. We dive deep into a very important esoteric law to understand. That's the law of 7 and the necessity of conscious shocks and the hidden forces that derail progress both from within and without. We will also look at how the ego cloaks itself in spiritual ambition, how progress fades, and why many seekers still fall into the traps of spiritual bypassing and resistance. In part 2, as a lot of listeners already know, there's always a part 2 for members. If you're not a member yet, you can sign up at my website, veilofreality.com/membership, to get access to all the second part podcast episodes. In part 2, we go deeper into what it really takes to stay the course. We examine the 3 foundational qualities that anchor the path of real transformation, which is spiritual will, sincerity, and humility, and really dive deep into 3 of them and the misunderstandings, misperceptions of that as well. Because these qualities really protect the seeker not only from delusion, but also open the door to grace, divine guidance, and also divine protection from hostile forces, interferences, and so forth. And we will also discuss in part 2 the Luciferic temptation. That's really important to understand, especially nowadays. That's the subtle hijacking of awakening through spiritual pride, illusion, grandiosity, and inflation. And most importantly, how to recognize it within ourselves and resist its influence. All right, let's get into this law of 7. It is also known as the law of octaves, and why it is so important to understand when it comes to staying the course of inner work, specifically inner work. And it's really important to understand that one of the greatest illusions of modern life, what we have, is the belief that we are consistent, that once we begin something with passion or determination, enthusiasm, and so forth, we'll just continue moving in a straight line towards its fulfillment until we have reached the goal. Not only in inner life, but you can, or inner work, but you can really relate this to anything in life, any ambition, any goal you may have. But as the Russian mystic Gurdjieff pointed out in the book In Search of Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky, and it was also later on expanded in Muravyi's Gnosis, nothing in nature moves a straight line. No human thought, no emotion, no action, nothing. Everything really unfolds in waves, spirals, and curves. And along the way, we inevitably hit friction points. These are moments where our original direction weakens, shifts, or can even reverse entirely.
It also relates, but Carl Jung, I'm not sure, said this particularly, but he talked about this idea of individuation involving, labyrinths or mandalas where we basically spiral around the center, understanding the self from different vantage points, basically. So the reason why we keep spiraling around or circling around the same problems and wounds is actually inherent to the process of individuation. But he didn't actually point out that there will be points where you actually can stop and even reverse or shift.
Oh, interesting.
Or lose, focus. He kind of talked about it as a spiral that kind of continuously moves out. And from what I know, he didn't actually talk about it reversing or shifting or moving, but he did talk about the spiral And that's why he loved the mandala so much. He liked this idea of that in individuation. We keep coming against the same issue, the same problem, the same themes, and we spiral around it and understand it from different vantage points.
Yeah, that definitely relates to the law of seven. And even beyond Gurdjieff or Muraviev, you see that idea in many other traditions of inner work hinting at that, these inflection points. And the law of seven is actually in itself a circle, but it needs certain shocks to keep moving when we talk about that. So the law of seven is really an esoteric principle that reveals a hidden structure behind something we see all the time, meaning the inability to follow through with any goal or aim you have. In this case, we talk about sincere psychospiritual work. And that kind of work that actually leads out of the matrix too, into real embodiment and awakening. We're talking about the awakening process. And we'll show how this law of seven is very important to understand if you're really sincerely interested in an awakening, transcending the matrix, and all of this. Because can be very easily not understood, and then we get trapped again in the second matrix, as Neil Kramer talked about this, the mind labyrinth of our own thoughts and so forth, and keeps us going in cycles and loops rather than spiraling out, so to speak. So the law of seven in a nutshell explains why so many people start the work, be it shadow work, meditation, trauma healing, whatever it is, right, with real sincerity, only to hit a wall or slowly drift off, self-sabotage, and quietly abandon the process altogether. I think we all can relate to this in many ways. Now, the structure behind it follows a musical principle. That's also why it's called the law of octaves. Think of a musical scale. And the 7 notes of the law of 7 are do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. That's a complete octave. Don't get too hung up on the names right now. It will become clear as I go along here. But what's not commonly known is that within that octave, this law of 7, there are 2 specific intervals. These are points where the process doesn't automatically continue on its own. That means you need to actually inject new energy in forms of effort or awareness, or the whole thing will just falter, will collapse or reverse itself. Now, according to the law of 7, these intervals are, the first one is between mi and fa, and the second one between si and do later on. So again, we're using this just as a way to describe these intervals. And these intervals is where the real test begins, so to speak. Because this is where the energy naturally drops and resistance begins to intensify. And if a conscious shock, we'll talk about shocks shortly, which is a deliberate effort or a moment of presence, a sincere recommitment, isn't applied at these points, very important to understand, the process will either deviate from its original direction, will become stagnate or become mechanical, like that's when people feel stuck, or it can even reverse and regress into its opposite, when people completely get off back into sleep in the matrix, so to speak. That's why spiritual inspiration can turn into apathy, why deep insight can become dogma, why practices that were once felt alive and life-changing start to feel dry and lifeless. Also in relationships. That's why relationships drift into unconscious patterns and get mistaken for love, like codependency and all of that. And most importantly, this is why people abandon the very work that could have transformed them, often without realizing it.
And I think, to me, relationships are so key because your relationships will mirror back to you whether you're caught in the pattern or not. Like the mind can deceive itself into thinking it's more awake and enlightened, but it's like Ram Dass says, like, go spend a weekend with your parents. Like, yes. No, seriously, like that's the real test is like, go actually look at your relationships, because if you think you're awake or evolved, but your relationships have stayed largely the same and are cycling around the same patterns, that's usually a sign that you're lying to yourself.
Yeah. And it's also easy to hide yourself from yourself by isolating yourself. Doing this, we think the ego already hijacks the process. Oh, I cannot relate to anyone. I'm just by myself.
Yeah.
Right. And that hides from deeper lessons to do this work in everyday life. All life is yoga, right? Exactly. So let's look at this first interval. So these 7 steps, 7 notes based on the law of 7, law of octaves. And there are 2 points where there needs to be an injection point to keep the movement, the energy going. So the first interval, as we said, is from me to far. This is where the initial moment or the momentum starts to break down, and it happens more often than people think. Very simple. You start something new, a new practice, a course, a book, a healing modality, whatever it may be. You're excited and committed, you start it, but then something shifts. The novelty wears off, the resistance kicks in, shadow material, unconscious stuff starts to bubble up, maybe inner child stuff. Emotions you've buried begin to surface, very uncomfortable. You don't really like to feel or confront. Suddenly life gets busy. Distractions happen, right? All of that. You don't have time. And then the unconscious wants to pull you back into the familiar. Means to kind of the gravitational pull to the old self. And the resistance comes in. And if that's not enough, at that point already entity interferences can happen as well. Because remember, certain forces out there, non-physical beings, they don't want you to awaken. So they will also resist that awakening process. They will tag exactly into your blind spots, into the resistance points, into your weaknesses. That may manifest as starting to feel foggy, confused, apathic, doubtful, just tired, just wanting to do it. Or you tell yourself you're too busy, you don't have time. You talk yourself out of the practice, basically, and you have all kinds of rationalization and justification and excuses why you disengage. Or, very in subtle ways, already pride can sneak in, spiritual pride. We'll talk about this more, especially in the second hour with Lucifer. And that can come in thoughts like, well, I've done this before already. I already know this. This isn't really for me. I need something else, and this and this and this, right? So many excuses.
Or I'm done with shadow work.
I'm done with shadow
To me,
work.
that actually, though, indicates that, because I don't think it is for everyone, the path of individuation. Even Carl Jung said that himself, that it isn't for everyone. You know, a lot of people will collapse at a certain stage, and, you know, you'll know the real intention is for you because you won't be able to keep lying to yourself for too long. It will be like keep niggling at the back of your head. It's like something that a voice you can't forget. If you can just put yourself back to sleep, then maybe it isn't for you.
Exactly. That's true. So that's the first interval already. And we talked later how we need to keep the momentum going through conscious shocks, so to speak. There are two types of shocks, which share about this shortly. But let's talk about the second interval, which happens later on at the end stage of the octave, according to the law of seven. That's from C to Do. And that is even more important because it comes right before a breakthrough, right before the completion of an octave, right through a really truly it's called a threshold in esotericism, where you really step through to a higher level integrated being or level of consciousness. There's this potential there. You're really on the edge of a real shift. But that's also when the ego resists the most, the wounded inner child, the shadow parts come up, hostile forces, interferences, attacks increase. This is a really big test. So the shift is close, but the ego still resists the surrender to a higher truth. There's the fear of the unknown, fear of facing the lies of the conditioned ego personality, of still holding on to some sort of identity. Old habits can resurface, more distractions, even addictive patterns suddenly return with force. And as I just mentioned, hostile forces may escalate interferences, injecting all kinds of thoughts of doubt or inflating with pride or weaponizing flattery. And that's also when here already the Luciferic impulse comes in. Again, we'll go deeper into this in the second hour, in the form of spiritual pride, right? That resurfaces as a protective mechanism and then can sound like, oh, I've already integrated this. I'm done with shadow work, like Laura just said. Oh, this is just basic. I'm beyond this now. I need more advanced knowledge or information. I need something more special. This is also often then when people walk away from the work, most often not out of defeat, but out of the illusion of completion. That's the biggest deception, by the way. They think they're done. They think they have arrived. It's a kind of false type of awakening. But they've just stepped out of the process right before a new octave could begin. And again, this is definitely where the Luciferic temptation shows up big time, especially nowadays, and we'll go deep into this in part 2 of the podcast. So it's really important to understand in the context of the law of 7 that nothing remains the same. Nothing stays neutral. Nothing stays always on the same level. There's always change. Change is the only constant, basically, in creation. But every process either ascends, so to speak, it means develops, it integrates, it transforms, or it descends, it degenerates, it disintegrates, it fragments, it becomes more mechanical. So if we're not actively applying effort, presence, and sincerity, even certain discipline, spiritual will in all of this, we're descending. There's no in-between. That's how this law really operates. And this is how many people deceive themselves. They keep doing the practices, going through the motions, repeating the words, but it's been done in a very mechanical way. There's also the issue, it's also warned about in spiritual tradition, just to meditate mechanically or do these practices mechanically but without much presence or intention behind it, because the essence is gone. Now, as I said at the beginning, it's important not to get overly fixated on the musical scale itself and the name of the different notes. It's not about mapping out every moment in life to me or far or see and all these intellectualizing this whole law of seven or the law of the scales or octaves. You can read more about it in Search of the Miraculous or Gnosis by Gurdjieff and Muraviev, respectively, to learn more about it from an esoteric perspective. But I just want to give a workable idea or understanding of this law because it's a cosmic law of movement. It applies across all levels of life. You can also apply it to your health, to your relationships, your spiritual practice, your career, your goals in life. Each of these areas move through their own octaves, often at the same time and nested within one another. And they all need these inflection points. Otherwise, it just disintegrates. So it's important just to understand that each octave contains its own intervals or friction points depending on your karma also, your level of consciousness, your current soul lessons. All of that determines how the law of seven or the law of octaves operates in your own life. And the key is, again, not to obsess over where you're on the scale. Again, it's just a framework to use to work with. The key is just to learn how to recognize when the intervals happen when you're in it. When the resistance appears or when the excuses arise, when old patterns try to pull you back, when the path feels all like discouraging and you're just annoyed or just discouraged and all of that, or when pride takes over and you think you're already done and better and all of this, when the ego hijacks the process.
So basically you need to recognize, and then I would argue that the inner friction you generate to put yourself back on the path, even when it's most uncomfortable, even when you most are resisting, is actually exactly the fuel that you need to transform yourself. And it actually also helps you develop an essential quality within yourself that's really important for all of life. It's like for finishing anything, if you can push past your own resistance and do it when you don't want to do it, yes, that helps you in every single area of life. Like, because there's so many things that we would rather not do. We'd rather just check out, scroll our phones.
That's when really the change
lose
happens.
Ourselves in addiction. And the moment that you catch yourself and you do something different, I would argue this is also extremely valuable in all areas of your life to push past that friction. I forget, there's actually a term for this. I'm not thinking of it, but there's actually a term for when you generate this kind of energy, the push past friction. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the necessity of shocks to awaken. I know this a lot personally. I actually have Pluto conjunct my sun and square my moon, unfortunately. So actually that's why I got into evolutionary astrology, which I'll talk about how it links to in a second, because I realized that if I don't do this work, the work will come to me in the form of outer events. So and I realized this before I even got into evolutionary astrology and had some sort of framework for this. And Gurdjieff also agrees with this because we sometimes, we can resist for decades, I would argue. And I would also argue it's a blessing when you experience an outer event, even if it's catastrophic, that forces you to look at yourself because it gives you an opportunity to evolve. So Gurdjieff said in this quote, "Awakening is possible only for those who seek it and want it, for those who are ready to struggle with themselves and work on themselves for a very long time and very persistently in order to attain it. Speaking in general, what is necessary to awaken a sleeping man? A good shock is necessary. But when a man is fast asleep, one shock is not enough. Like a long period of continual shocks is needed." I see this in people a lot. Like sometimes like one bad relationship is not enough. Like you have to get into like a bunch to be like, okay, that's enough.
Yep.
This is too much suffering. I don't want to go through this anymore. Okay. So this is where the law of 7 links directly to transformation. So if you want to complete an octave, if you want to fulfill something, you want to stay aligned with your aim that you started out with, then these shocks are not optional. They're going to be required on this process. So a shock in this sense is a conscious or an accidental infusion of energy that interrupts this downward spiral. It kind of gives you the oomph that reinvigorates the process. It puts you back on track. And without these shocks, these transformations tend to not happen. You just tend to become more resistant. You go back to your old patterns, and you might even convince yourself, oh, I'm still doing the work, but you're kind of doing the same that you were before. And so what is a shock? A shock is anything that re-energizes a process that's starting to stall. It's anything that realigns you with your original aim or deepens your interest in it. It's anything that can interrupt these unconscious habits. It's anything that hones your attention, helps you cut through distraction. And it really reopens the door to you making a different choice than the one you made before, rather than what you always have done. The shock also doesn't always have to be dramatic. It can be more subtle. It can be, realizing your screen time is like way up and and then you're like, okay, I got to stop doing this, and you block off the apps. Or, you could realize, like I had this experience recently, like watching a TV show where I was like, you know what, I don't really feel great after I watch this, even though it's like kind of fulfilling in the moment. I want to do something different. It's like that recognition where you're like, you know what, this is not the best choice for me, and you choose something different. It can involve just sitting with a feeling instead of numbing out. I think that we all have strategies. I think the most popular strategy is actually not a drug, it's intellectualization. We escape into our heads, where instead of actually just feeling the feeling, we go into overanalysis. And that's one of the biggest signs that I know I'm avoiding a feeling, is when I go into like an insane overanalysis spiral, which I think is happening to people even more lately, especially with the South Node in Virgo, ruled by Mercury. So these conscious choices or these moments of shock tend to change the trajectory of the octave. That's the key. So without it, we tend to drift back asleep. We tend to drift back into old programming. And Gurdjieff also outlined that there's 2 kinds of shocks. There's conscious shocks and external shocks, which is very interesting because evolutionary astrology, also Jeffrey Wolf Green, outlined a very similar thing. So, and this is to me how I validate any theory. Well, first I validate it off my own direct experience, but if something is true, it will be said by many different teachers in different ways across the ages. And that's how you can tell if something is true or not. Validate it through your own experience and see if other people have said it in their own way. So there's conscious shocks. These are the ones that we do consciously on purpose. These require effort. They require will. Some example is, what Gurdjieff calls self-remembering, where we witness something instead of identifying with our own reactivity. Presence, we stay conscious and connected to that moment. Anything that reconnects us to our original aim. So, remembering why you began this work in the first place. Like for me, actually, for shadow work, for example, I realized that number one, I was walking around with an immense amount of shame with myself. I wanted to hide parts of myself. The only way that I was able to integrate my past, especially with like addiction and my own traumas, was actually with shadow work, with just facing it honestly and authentically. So, feeling uncomfortable with myself was actually, feeling uncomfortable with myself. When I get uncomfortable myself later on, I realize, okay, this is the moment where I need to do the work that I know actually helps me integrate these parts of myself that I'm exiling into the shadow. Staying open to honest feedback or reflections from others, even if it challenges your ego. I think, not all feedback from others is valid, but a lot of it is and sometimes, the most annoying part is actually the feedback from your worst enemy can have like a seed of truth within it. And if you're sincere, you will actually take that feedback, even though it's coming from like the person you didn't want to hear it from.
Even if it may be overlaid with all kinds of
For
projections.
sure.
Right?
I know. Like that's the whole thing is like, even with the person that you dislike the most, if you're really sincere in the work and they say something about you, and, you know, you'll try to find exactly if anything that they said triggered you, because that's the seed of truth within it.
That's true.
But, you know, we also need people who are sincere in their own work. It is important to have people around us that we can talk to about this process that are also engaged in this work ourselves, because they can give us honest feedback and reflections as well. And this is like, essentially, the role of the guru is to shock us, not to coddle us, not to like make things comfortable for us, but to, you know, tell us the truth, to keep us accountable, to keep the student from falling asleep. And the issue with these shocks and why we resist them is they usually don't feel good. And they also, because they don't feel good, they'll come with inner resistance, where we'll just get angry at the person who gave us the feedback, or we'll just kind of continue, like we'll notice the shock, but then we'll escape into the head or escape into a distraction or an addiction. And Gurdjieff called being able to stay with the shock conscious suffering. So this is when we stop obeying these kind of mechanical patterns, these wounded parts. We stop blaming others, but we just allow ourselves to experience the feeling. Like the conscious suffering, if someone gives you a piece of feedback you don't like, is be like, wow, that really kind of hits and it hurts. And instead of getting angry at them, you just take a moment to be like, wow, that kind of hits me somewhere. Is there part of me that believes that's true? Or is there part of me that knows that's true? Because your own emotions are the barometer. And it doesn't mean that every time you have a negative emotion, it means that something is true. It means that you believe that about yourself. So if someone like calls you a name and you actually get hurt by it, it's because a part of you actually believes that that's true about yourself.
And also without getting defensive.
Yes, exactly. So these intentional shocks are really important. Otherwise, no real growth happens. And then there's external shocks. And as I'll talk about in a moment, these also tend to come because we've resisted for so long that they've become necessary. So this is like a breakup or an illness. We lose a job. It can just be something karmic, like we lose someone we love. It can also be something global, like the pandemic. It can be, a moment of synchronicity. It can be we meet someone who really changes our life, or we come across a piece of writing that really hits us. And so these shocks are meant to shake us out of our comfort zone. They tend to disrupt something in our lives. And if we meet them consciously, they can be catalytic. But if we meet them unconsciously, especially if we start blaming other people or fall into self-pity, I've noticed, those are the two things that kind of stall the process greatly. But because they're a double-edged sword. If we meet these shocks consciously, they're very intense. But if we meet them unconsciously, we tend to go into denial, distraction, blame, victimhood, and they can deepen the sleep. So because these shocks are kind of the shocks that people tend to fear, they also tend to resist them the most when they come up and fall into denial or blame or distraction. Because I would argue these external shocks tend to be almost like encompassed with like the most amount of pain and suffering a lot of the time. So we resist them because we resist feeling, we don't want to feel pain, obviously. And so these can get, I think if we experience too many of these in a row, we can actually almost become traumatized. I know myself, that's kind of what happened to me. We could spiral into addiction. We can abandon the path entirely. We can go into a self-destructive path. I definitely know that absolutely happened to me. These external shocks were coming from a result of my own sleeplessness, but then I was even making it worse by spiraling into self-destruction. So these moments are really critical because how we meet that shock determines whether we evolve or whether we regress, basically. So like when we do have a marriage fall apart or a job fall apart, how you meet that moment will determine the course of the rest of your life. And I've seen this happen again and again. So like when I see people have a big relationship fall apart, especially, jobs, I find that people tend to let go of them a little bit easier, but relationships are really huge. if they don't meet that moment consciously, they go back even deeper asleep than before. And they usually just blame the partner. And then they're, sometimes it ends up them just isolating for the rest of their lives. So what's interesting is this also relates to a concept of evolutionary astrology, how Pluto transits. And I would argue any outer planet transit, even especially Neptune or even Saturn, or sorry, not Neptune, Uranus or Saturn, they affect you depending on how you respond to them and your own personal karma. So with Pluto transits in particular, Jeffrey Wolf Green talked about how there's two kinds of growth. There's steady growth and there's cataclysmic growth. So steady growth comes when we realize an internal or external source of stagnation that's limiting us. We become aware of it. We want to find out the source. We work on it, and something within us changes and we evolve. That's the kind of growth that you engage in when you engage in the path of inner work, which is a great motivation for doing inner work, because when you don't engage in it, you tend to experience the second kind of growth, which is cataclysmic growth. And this is when an event happens externally that creates an emotional shock where something is forcefully removed from your life, a relationship, a job, etc. And this happens because there was some level of resistance to dealing with the situation before. And I've seen this so many times where someone is like sick of a relationship, and then the person or like the relationship is in a state of stagnation, and they're just kind of like codependently like living together, like ships passing through the night. And then the person ups and leaves, or the person ups and has an affair. And then they're kind of like, well, how the hell did that happen? Because you were resisting the conscious growth, and so the cataclysmic growth had to happen. So these situations happen because you resisted your evolution to the extent that an external event has to be required for growth. And I find this principle is really important in working with any astrological transit, but especially Pluto, Uranus, Saturn even. You need to use this transit as a moment to work on the areas of life that it highlights, to not like fear these transits, like what is going to happen to me. That's like fearing your own karma, because sometimes these external shocks happen because of fruition of karma, nothing we resisted and did too. But a lot of times it happens because of our own resistance, and they had to happen. So if you refuse the opportunity to work on yourself when you have the opportunity, when something happens in your life, more shocks are necessary. So how life affects us, how astrology transits affects us, really depends to how our souls tend to respond to this process of evolution.
That's fascinating. So does it realize you're right? This concept of the law of seven and Gurdjieff's and the necessity for shocks is definitely mirrored in evolutionary astrology and the purpose of Pluto.
Yes.
And how we respond to everybody as Pluto transits at some point, and can be very severe shock or not that severe, depending on our karmic situation of have we learned the lessons before, the signs were all around, right? And then how you respond to it.
Exactly.
That's really what it comes down to. It's always how we respond to it.
And I can tell you, having gone through every single Pluto transit now, I'm still finishing up one more because of the way that my chart is set up, that my life was really intense the more I resisted what I needed to do. And and that's funny because I realized this before I found out about evolutionary astrology. That's how I knew it was true, because it mirrored something I actually realized on my own, where I was like, I need to start working on myself. Otherwise, it comes to me in the form of an outer event. And I found that to be too traumatic.
Yes.
So and it doesn't mean that I don't avoid outer events. I do, because of karma, but at least I avoid the unnecessary ones at this point.
The unnecessary suffering.
Exactly.
So to speak. Yeah. Now, giving a very good example of a global shock that affected all of humanity was the COVID pandemic back in 2020, especially between 2020 and 2022. Obviously, when the COVID pandemic or plandemic hit with all the fear-mongering, lies, and propaganda, it triggered a massive collective fear of death, coupled with the lockdowns, social ostracization, and widespread mistrust. It tore families apart and relationships over the vaccine issue and political polarization, destroyed countless businesses, shattered the livelihoods of millions. It really left a massive psychic scar across the collective nervous system, as I would call it. Some people are still caught in millions, not even billions of people, and they don't even know that they're still caught in that trauma, matrix trauma installment, so to speak. But looking back, I've seen two main responses to this crisis, especially between 2020 and 2022. On one side, we know that it pushed people deeper into trauma and dissociation. Right? They were really affected by the shock negatively. They got stuck in freeze, fight, and flight. They believed the official narrative without any question. They bought into the fear propaganda. Many took the vaccine out of fear or media propaganda. The nervous system totally locked into survival mode. And many of them have still not come out of it, so to speak. They're still in that state, kind of numbed, hypervigilant, or shut down. On the other side of the coin, this shock actually triggered an awakening in the sense that people didn't use positively. Many people started to wake up, right? This shock or the global pandemic disrupted their previous worldview. It pushed them into questioning what they were being told and taught, like really made them question, hold on, what is really going on here? Not just even about the pandemic, but about everything, right? They started questioning the media, science, medicine in general, even education, politics, the history, the whole system itself, the matrix. But it's interesting to note that there's a nuance here because even that so-called awakening took two different paths. Now, a lot of people I've seen, especially who just woke up over the past 5 years, so to speak, by questioning official culture, official narratives more, they fell deep into the rabbit hole of conspiracies. Obviously, there are conspiracies, but some people dove head on into it, and their whole focus remained completely external. Now, everything all of a sudden became a psyop. Everything is a trap. Everything is scripted, right? But this too can be a trauma response, kind of schizoid split rooted in hypervigilance and paranoia because of the shock taking also a negative turn. It led to more disembodiment, dissociating, especially black and white thinking, meaning in an inability to see nuance in events or in people, a highly dysregulated nervous system as always. So that can also be a fear response in itself. It's kind of the black pill mindset, which we have talked about as well. There's really just an endless exposure to how corrupt and evil the world is and kind of stuck in a doom and gloom mindset, so to speak. But others, again, used the shock differently who are woken, right? They really didn't just question the system and got into conspiracies, right? And all of that and external research, but they questioned themselves. They put the mirror within themselves. And that's really the appropriate use of a shock like that. They question their life choices, their relationships, their attachments, their real purpose. They ask the ultimate question, hold on, who am I in all of this? Why do I do what I want? What are my goals or what am I? Why am I here? What is my life really about? So from them, the shock became a disillusionment of their own lives, their own personality structure and identity, because disillusionment is a necessity on the path towards awakening. All spiritual traditions have talked about, to the death of the conditioned, wounded, or programmed ego personality, that then opened the way towards a deeper, even not only the inner work, but to a deeper level of awakening. So they started looking within, beyond the ego surface. That's the kind of shock Gurdjieff really talk about here, one that can awaken you to a higher level of consciousness if it's met consciously and turned inwardly with humility and aspiration for truth. And that's what I've seen as well, right? So that's why I've always said, and I've said this many times before in even previous podcasts and my articles, this was a great opportunity because every crisis, no matter how dark and how horrifying it may be, it contains a teaching function, and it contains a seed, a potential shock for a deeper awakening, a true transformation. Like a shock contains or carries the potential seed for a deeper awakening, but it all depends on how we meet it.
And I would also argue that suffering embraced and processed consciously burns off karma, because if you have a shocking event happen to you and it is a product of just karma come to fruition, in your personal life, if you blame and get into the same pattern and resist to complain, you're actually setting yourself up to experience that shock again. But if you accept it with grace and humility and meet it with compassion in yourself, you actually burn off the karmic pattern from repeating.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. A lot of people also get stuck with these global shocks just in victim blame, right? They just want to fuck Fauci and all these evildoers. We just kill them. Somebody needs to be blamed and burnt down. Not understanding the bigger evolutionary context of an event like this. Also the evolutionary teaching function of evil, for example.
And in their own lives. I see it all the time. Like they get really into like everyone's a narcissist kind of literature and then hyper focus on the problems out there, which I'm not saying there's many pathological people and problems out there, but if you do that to avoid your own suffering, then you're actually attracting that situation even more into your life because you are almost like creating an energetic field where it's necessary that it will be attracted to you again for your own sake. So a shock is not also suffering for its own sake. It's not just about suffering. It's not just about pain and struggle for the sake of it. It's about shifting you into a new pattern, giving you an opportunity, bringing new energy, breaking you out of a loop of unconscious repetition. So it helps revive your original intention for doing the work or helps it evolve to something higher. Like, for example, I'm pretty serious meditator. I meditate at least, 20 minutes a day, but I was going much longer before the pandemic. And I realized recently, through actually a series of dreams that I needed to deepen that process even more. And one of the things that made me realize that is that the meditation is actually one of the biggest ways that I can relieve suffering in my life. Basically, it keeps me more present. It helps me become more connected to myself, to God, to others, to the world around me. So, realizing that I wasn't feeling as great as I was before helped me revive that original intention. So, it didn't really take like a massive shock in my outer life, but more a bigger shock in my inner life where actually my dreams started showing me, you need to get back into this. And I was like, okay. And I did. And then I was like, okay, this is meant to be the foundation of my life. Because most of us will fall back asleep. We will try and avoid discomfort. We live mechanically. We get addicted to things very easily, especially ease and distraction. We live in this era where even just having an attention span that's longer than 10 minutes has become rare. So it's getting much worse and much harder. And many of the shocks that we need end up presenting themselves as a crisis if we avoid it for long enough. But the pain alone won't wake you up. You have to consciously engage with the shock to allow it to fulfill its function. And I would argue when the pain arrives, to greet it, to welcome it, to say yes to it with compassion, because the pain will open your heart. It will transform you. It will, almost every single spiritual tradition says that the inner light of the self comes in through the heart or comes in through the heart center. So every heartbreaking experience we go through, every difficult experience will actually open you up to a deeper awakening if you meet it in the right way. And this doesn't mean like you wallow in it either, but allow yourself to feel what's actually there. Because most people, when the shock comes and it's painful, they'll go into their minds right away. They'll intellectualize, they'll justify, they'll blame, they'll try to bypass it. They want to avoid it. So like they'll feel pain and immediately they go into some sort of defense mechanism like intellectualization, denial, projection, all of the defense mechanisms that we have. And I would argue intellectualization is one of the most popular ones where we escape into the head instead of like having a breakup and being like, wow, I'm really hurt by this. I got to be with this grief and feel it and process it. They'll be like, well, what the hell happened? And why did it fall apart? And what's wrong with that person? And like, or like, if you're like me, you look at the astrology chart for like hours, right? So we avoid that shock when it comes, or we'll fall into self-pity. This is a very popular one. Poor me. Why does this always happen to me? The world is a messed up place. It's capitalism. It's communism. It's Democrats. It's whatever.
It's a prison planet.
They project onto people, right? Like this guy's just an evil narcissist or whatever. I'm not saying there's not evil people in the world or whatever, but the moment that you blame the experience on the other person and focus on them, you're actually giving your power away. So it's the number one reason that you should avoid it is because the moment that you hyper focus on them and not on what attracted you to that experience, you're actually giving the power to that person that you think is so evil. So they blame their family or society, and the opportunity is lost. And sometimes the opportunity doesn't come for a very long time. We should be grateful, as hard as they are, when these shocks come, because they give us an opportunity to evolve. They give us more fuel for the fire. I know in Vajrayana Buddhism, they talk about how, the more chaotic things are, the more material you have to evolve. And I think we all experienced that in the past 5 years, but we all experience these moments in our personal life where we have a lot of material and then it kind of calms down. And I would say that moment when we have a lot of material, you can make quantum leaps in your own evolution if you work with it consciously, or the next life too. So, we should be grateful when these shocks come in a single life because we're giving an opportunity to work on ourselves.
It reminds me of our last podcast about the mystery of divine grace. And shock can be also grace, fierce grace, tough grace, right? To wake you out of your slumber. Great. So this concludes the first part where we explored the deeper dynamics behind why so many people fall off the path and the illusion of linear progress, the hidden mechanics of the law of seven, and the necessity of shocks, as we just explored. But there's another layer to this process that we haven't touched yet. And that really determines whether you stay the course or slip back into old patterns. What makes really the difference between genuine transformation and spiritual bypassing? That's really the deeper question, or intellectualization. That's a big, big trap nowadays. And that's what we're going to explore in part 2. We go deep into very important 3 foundational pillars that sustain the path and use these shocks to get us stay on the octave into another layer and past threshold. And that's spiritual will, sincerity, and humility. We'll dive deeper into what that means, the misconceptions about it. There's a lot of misconceptions about these 3 attitudes or aspirations as well. And then we'll dive definitely deeper more into the Luciferic temptation that can easily hijack the seeker's path without them even knowing that. And Laura and I will also share more personal experiences with that as well. Again, part 2 is available for members. If you want to become a member, it's only $11 a month. Go to my website, veilofreality.com/membership, and you'll have access to over 160 episodes. Parts 2, that where we share many, many also practical guidance and practices for you to engage in during this time of transition. Thank you for listening, and we'll be right back.